Bloodborne was released on the 24th of March 2015 by From Software, the creators of Dark Souls and Elden Ring, and directed by the devil himself, Hidetaka Miyazaki. I mean it, this man is evil, but only recently did I actually play Bloodborne, and it was great, but it has its issues, which become more apparent if you've played any other FromSoft game. But before I begin, I will be talking about both the main game and the DLC, Hunter's Nightmare, so even though I don't really understand any of the Soulsborne lore, I will be talking about late game bosses at some point in this video, so quick spoiler warning, and look at this chart, or graph, or whatever the hell it's called, and think, are you a part of the non-subscribed? If you are, hit that massive red button, as it's free and you can unsubscribe later if you think I'm a prick. Also, while you're at it, like and comment too, because that would be so based. However, with that said and done, let's begin with a little bit of gameplay. So Bloodborne has a lot of good gameplay. For example, the trick weapons, which were a real nice change up from the other FromSoft games I've played, as unlike other FromSoft games that are practically packed with dozens of different weapons, Bloodborne wasn't. Instead, it only had a few weapons, but all of them had a different way to be used. And I really enjoyed that. And the way you could use guns in the game, but I very rarely used my sidearms. However, as I said before, Bloodborne has its issues, and one of its biggest problems is the lanterns. Now, unlike in Dark Souls or Elden Ring, where you can simply rest at a site of grace or bonfire, in Bloodborne you must go to the Hunter's Dream every time you go to a lantern, which can be a massive pain in the ass. I found myself rarely going, and you can't fast travel without going to the Hunter's Dream, making the whole thing quite annoying, but at least the Hunter's Dream does act as a good hub world, unlike the Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls 3, which was just too big. But another problem I have is the movement in the game, which is a bit strange to me. For example, in the other two FromSoft games I've played, the main ways of dodging are rolling and backstepping, but in Bloodborne that's changed up quite a bit. As in Bloodborne you can dodge roll, but if you try rolling out of a sprint, you first do a jump into a roll, which is a really strange mechanic. And when you're locked on to an enemy, you can only backstep for some reason, which is quite annoying. I just find it really strange that it works like that. But one last thing before I move on is the blood vials, which are okay after you get a handle on them, but grinding out blood vials can be a bit boring, so if you do end up playing Bloodborne after this, I recommend buying blood vials off the merchant in the Hunter's Dream before beating Gascoigne, as they are really cheap prior to Gascoigne. But yeah, most of my problems with Bloodborne are in the gameplay side of things, but there is one boss who I'm gonna have to have a rant about at some point. However, let's move on and talk a little bit about the world of Bloodborne. The world of Bloodborne is something that I really don't understand, but what I can tell you is that it's absolutely stunning. So I'll be talking about some of my favourite locations in the entire game. First of all being Central Yharnam, which is at the very beginning of the game, and it works really well as a starting area, but my favourite thing about it is the fact it looks like a place I know all too well. Britain! But no, in all seriousness, I really love the design as it gives off a very 19th century London vibe, and the winding back alleys make it feel even more like 19th century London, more specifically Whitechapel. But next location I want to talk about is Maria's Astral Tower, which is actually a boss arena in the DLC, and I will talk about Maria later, but now I want to solely focus on her clock tower, which I found really beautiful because of the sun shining through the clock behind Maria, and the wooden floor, which was kind of falling apart. It gave the whole arena a sort of chaotic beauty, and did a great job at keeping with the gothic style that the game does so well. But then the last location I want to talk about is the Fishing Hamlet, which is based off of H.P. Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth, a book that I haven't read, but knowing Lovecraft, it probably had a racist undertone. However, despite the extremely racist Lovecraft, the Fishing Hamlet is absolutely beautiful, and even though it looks a little like a Dark Souls game, it still manages to fit with Bloodborne. That's something I can't say about the entire game. Dark Forest. I'm sorry, but there was no need for this game to have a forest section. But hey, Miyazaki has some kind of addiction to dark forests and poison swamps, and trust me, both are in Bloodborne, and they are really unnecessary. Locations like this belong in a Dark Souls game or maybe Elden Ring, but it doesn't fit in Bloodborne. At least that's my opinion on it. Also, it's not just the locations I love in this game, except Dark Forest, but no, I also love the armor, which is very different from your average FromSoft game, and I really like it. They all look really cool, and that's what really matters with armor in a FromSoft game. Who gives a shit about stats? Not me, I can tell you that much. Which is why I'll be playing the game in nothing but doll's clothes. Yeah, I'm the MF who plays games with a female skin, and what you gonna do about it? But my need to play a female character in video games aside, that's all I have to say on the world of Bloodborne, which I really don't have many very problems with outside of the Dark Forest. It just felt too much like a fantasy setting and not at all gothic. But yeah, I really like Bloodborne's world, and if I hadn't played Elden Ring, it probably would be my favourite, but I'm a Melina simp, what can I say? Although, that is all I have to say on the world, so let's talk about the bosses. From Software games do a lot right, but what they do best is the bosses. So I'll be talking about some of the best and worst bosses in Bloodborne's main game and DLC, starting with the main game, of course, but before we start, a quick tier list of all bosses in Bloodborne. I'll be honest with you all, I wasn't impressed with the bosses in the main game, with one of them in particular being the bane of my existence. This boss I'm talking about is Mikolash, host of the Nightmare. Now this guy is the jammiest piece of shit you will ever fight, and I found him more of a pain in the ass to fight than the Godskin duo. And both times I sped through this game to get footage for this video, I had to fight him, and it was not fun. This guy will literally just run away from you over and over again until you finally corner him in a room, and then, in his second phase, he just whips out a bullshit one-hit kill move to just absolutely mess you the hell up. He's just annoying and really boring to fight, so I have no idea what any of the FromSoft devs were thinking when making this thing. But the most dogshit boss aside, let's talk about the best boss in the main game, who is Gehrman, the final boss of Bloodborne. And the way he's just trying to mercy kill you is kind of funny to me. But no, his moveset is unique, and it feels like every time you take a hit, it's because of your own lack of skill, instead of just a crappy one-hit magic spell, which is stupidly hard to dodge. Not to mention, Gehrman is basically just you, but older and more experienced. And I love that you get to free him from all of his suffering in 2 of the endings, or you can just let him mercy kill you and get sent into New Game Plus, which I did in my first playthrough. Not actually knowing that I would be sent into New Game Plus, which is actually another problem I have with the game, as unlike the other FromSoft games I've played, this one just doesn't ask you if you want to go into New Game Plus, which probably could have saved me a lot of time while making this video. But hey, moving on, you're probably all wondering, will he talk about Moon Presence and Queen Yharnam? Sure, I will. I found Moon Presence really underwhelming for a boss you have to fight to get the true ending. Like, the hell? I was able to beat him with 6 bloody blood vials, which I think is a pretty low amount for the true final boss. It took me more to beat Vicar Amelia on my first try. I don't want to talk about my first time fighting Amelia. I'm really not proud of how long it took me to beat her. But let's stop talking about Amelia and talk about Queen Yharnam. Oh, where do I begin? Ah, there's good. I never fought her. I know, but in my defense, I would rather take a corkscrew to my left nutsack instead of playing through all of the Chalice dungeons. And yes, it may not be a good defense, but I should hope you know where I'm coming from. Definitely not my balls if I had to play those Chalice dungeons. However, that is really all I have to say about the bosses in the main game, unless you want me to talk about Rom, the Vacuo Spider, but I can't imagine why you would want that, because he is the most underwhelming boss of all time. But if this video hits 40 likes, I will make a video solely around Rom, just for you guys. I'm nice like that. I do think we should move on to some DLC bosses though, so let's get cracking. The bosses in the DLC is where Bloodborne really kicks it up a notch, and I really love them, except for Living Failures, as that boss is ROM levels of boring. But the first DLC boss I really want to talk about is Ludwig, whose fight is a brilliant spectacle, with a wonderful OST that you should be able to hear now. However, it's not just the music that makes Ludwig a great boss, it's really due to his incredible moveset and stunning design. Oh, and of course the fact he's wielding the Moonlight Sword, or should I call it my beloved. And seeing my beloved wielded by Ludwig, the strange horseman, it's just great. But as much as I love Ludwig, my favourite boss in the DLC is Maria. And it's not just because I'm a horny Kuma simp boy, which to be fair I definitely am, but Maria is an exception. She's an incredible boss, and in a way, an upgraded version of Gehrman. Also, her boss arena is perfect, as I talked about earlier, and will continue to praise because it is perfect. You can't stop me, and the whole progression of the fight is great. She soaks her weapons in blood and then lights them on fire near the end of her health bar, making it slowly more difficult instead of abruptly going into a second phase like so many other bosses do. So yeah, I will always simp for Maria and Moonlight Sword, but the next boss I want to talk about made me into Stephen Merchant in Portal 2, as right after I beat him, I said some things. The boss I'm talking about is Orphan of Kos, who is the Millennia before Millennia existed, because this guy is a ball ache and will mess you up more than a 6-year-old going up against Cynthia in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl for the first time. So if you are going to play Bloodborne, you best be prepared for this guy, because the second he pops out of his mummy's vagina, he will be ready to kick ass like no other, using its bloody placenta as a battle axe, glaive, or he will just pick a bubble off of it and sling it at you, making his moveset completely mental, as sometimes when you think you're out of his range, he will dive at you, or just swing his weapon out like a yo-yo, making him extremely hard to dodge, and really hard to punish. My personal recommendation is attack his arse when he does a diving attack, or when he does a powerful slamming attack. And remember to never start panic rolling, because if you do, it won't end well. In fact, you will be slapped around like a little bitch. And weapons wise, just stick with the basics, like a soul cleaver with lightning paper, and you should beat him after a few hours of attempts, which I would say is very reasonable for Millennia's predecessor. And I'm not going to talk about Lawrence the First Vicar, because he's just the cleric beast, an early game boss but on fire, and he eventually loses his legs. So yeah, I ain't going to bother with him. That's all I have to say about the DLC bosses, but I can tell you this, they're better than the main game bosses, which are probably the worst out of all of the FromSoft games I've played yet. But the DLC has some of the best bosses I have fought yet, so put some respect on their names. However, it is about time I conclude things. Overall, Bloodborne is a really great game, which has a lot of really cool mechanics and an absolutely stunning world, but even now, I find it really hard to overlook its bigger issues. For one, I find it pretty stupid that all of the best bosses in the game are a part of the DLC, which would be fine if it were a free DLC, but it isn't. In fact, it costs £15, which is really annoying seeing as the best bosses are in the DLC. Not to mention the issues with movement in the game and the lanterns, both being worse in comparison to the other FromSoft games I've played. But even after all I've just said, I really love this game, and its world is just incredible. So I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10, because what it does right, it does really right. However, that is all from me. But please do make sure to subscribe, smash that like button, and leave a comment down below, because it would mean the world to me. And now I'm off to watch some Varty videos and catch myself up on the Bloodborne lore. So goodbye until next time.